Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our third session of Understanding Roots of Racism, our educational series designed to increase understanding and awareness of policies and practices in health, housing, food insecurity, and transportation that over time have led to great disparities and inequities in our community for people of color. In order to make a difference, we really must first understand the problem. And in order to move forward, we must avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. We're here today because United Way is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything we do in our community. At United Way, we're hard at work eliminating barriers that prevent our neighbors from achieving their fullest potential. And racism is one of those barriers. Today, we're going to discuss systemic racism as it pertains to food access and insecurity. When you logged in today, you saw a few questions on the screen. What is the difference between food insecurity and food access? How convenient is it for you to access grocery stores and fresh food? Have you or anyone you've known ever had to forego a meal to allow your or their children to eat? It is our hope that upon the conclusion of this panel discussion, you will have answers to, or at least feel the need to further ponder these questions. Like you, I'm here to learn about the deep roots racism has in our community. Therefore, we have convened a dynamic group of experts to go on a journey with us this evening. Brandon Cosby from Flanner House, John Elliott from Gleaners, Representative Robin Shackelford from the Indiana General Assembly, Shelley Suttles from the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at IU Bloomington. And today I'm thrilled to introduce Tanya Hand, Senior Director of Transformational and Major Giving here at United Way of Central Indiana. Tanya has been with us for 5 years. In her role at United Way, she and her team are responsible for relationships with our major and transformational donors. It is, of course, our donors that make our work, including our Roots of Racism series, possible. Tanya, thank you for leading this discussion today.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be the guest moderator today, and I too am thrilled to have our panelists with us. Racism is a learned behavior. No one is born racist. It is something we are taught. So in order to change the behavior, we must first learn why the behavior exists. I applaud United Way of Central Indiana for this courageous conversation in seeking the answers to these questions. I am looking forward to a bold and interesting discussion as we learn about the history of racism as related to food insecurity and access. There's a direct correlation between hunger and health. Our first conversation in Understanding Roots of Racism series, we discussed health. If you've had the opportunity to join us for both of our previous panels, you certainly have seen that we are painting a picture for you. This is a picture of disparity among races and the effects that this disparity has had on our community. We have talked to you much about our ALICE families. ALICE is asset limited, income constrained, and employed. Please remember that there are 216,000 families in our community that are ALICE families. The scale of the overall food insecurity and food access challenge in our community is daunting. Do all grocery stores look like this? Wouldn't it be great if they could? Hunger impacts crime, education, health, worker productivity, diminished economic success. Hunger, obesity, and chronic illness are hurting taxpayers, employers, and our shared future. 33% of households have a member with diabetes. During our health panel, we discovered that more people of color suffer with diabetes. 58% of households have a member with high blood pressure. Once again, we shared the numbers and facts that more African Americans suffer from high blood pressure. But did you know that 79% of ALICE families purchase the cheapest food, regardless of associated health concerns? Is this related to access? Families who are food insecure have 44% higher health costs. In fact, nationally, more than $37 billion in additional health care costs is attributed to food insecurity. In Indiana, more than $1 billion in incremental health care costs are attributed to food insecurity. Food insecurity limits children's performance in school today and their physical, intellectual, and cognitive growth over a lifetime of missed opportunities. And we all know what milk can do for strong minds and strong bodies. African Americans are almost 4 times more likely to live in food deserts than whites. African American communities have 2.4 more fast food restaurant establishments per square mile, whereas white neighborhoods have only 1.5 fast food restaurants per square mile. The US food supply is plentiful enough to feed every person in the country, almost twice, even accounting for exports. But in the United States today, approximately 30 million people are unable to buy sufficient food to maintain good health. Why is this? And what can we do about it? Solving these challenges represents a massive cost avoidance opportunity for generations. This evening, we will hear from 4 experts in this area. Their bios are so extensive, I can't do them justice in the short time we have together here. However, you may read about them on our blog. So let's get started. Once again, I want to thank Brandon, Representative Shackelford, Shelley, and John. So we will begin with question 1. According to Feeding America, nearly 1 million individuals are food insecure. For our audience, can you explain what food insecure means and how does that differ from food access or food deserts? We hear the terms used interchangeably, but is there really a difference? Brandon, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think that, well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I think probably one of the easiest ways to get your head around these two concepts is to understand that access is a part of security, right? And so, or the lack thereof means that you're talking about food, the lack of food access is a part of food insecurity. But access means both the spatial accessibility, how far do you have to go in order to be able to get to a grocery store that actually offers nutritious, affordable, right? Because one of the points that I always try to make about accessibility is, for example, is like, I know exactly where the Bentley dealership is. I know how to get there, but because I can get there doesn't mean I can afford anything there once I arrive. And so we really have to be able to understand that access isn't just alone the physical space that it takes for you to get from point A to point B. But once you arrive there, can you afford what's available? And is what available actually nutritionally significant and relevant to you? And so access is a component of security, where you're also looking at things like, utilization, right? So is the food that is available to me that I have access to, is it culturally relevant to me? Is it fit into the diasporic component of my culture and heritage and diet? And so those elements are a part of food security as well that a lot of times don't get talked about.
Thank you. Thank you for that. John?
I'm muted. Sorry. I would agree with Brandon's definition, so I wouldn't add to that, but I'd reinforce with a couple of points. In your initial question, you mentioned pre-pandemic, we had 1 million food insecure Hoosiers, or right about 15%, but unfortunately that's now approaching a little over 32% as a result of the pandemic. So substantial jump in that. And I think in a way you could say the pandemic has impacted both food security and access. And certainly the response we've seen from the home delivery program and the family meal box distributions, all those numbers have gone up. Marion County in particular is of concern. Pre-pandemic, the food insecurity rate was high, but in all 21 counties increased, but we saw that jump from 32% of the meals gleaners distribute to 65% now. So we've really got to get a handle on Marion County in particular on the food insecurity side.
Thank you. Shelley, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I just like to say, point out kind of from a research perspective on how we treat food access and food security. So from a research perspective, I would say the two issues are not interchangeable. So limited food access, or what people describe as a food desert, and food insecurity are often confused and conflated, but in research, we like to definitely keep the terms separate and distinct. So when we think about defining food insecurity, we would define it as difficulty in acquiring food. And this can start with just general anxiety over being able to feed your family. You may have a food shortage in the household temporarily. This can lead to disrupted eating patterns where you would have reduced quality and reduced variety, desirability of your diet. And if you aren't able to navigate the hunger relief system or find support with friends and family, this can actually spiral into a situation where you would actually continually have disrupted eating patterns where you're starting to miss meals, you're starting to eat less than you normally would because you cannot financially afford to do so. So we know from Indie Hunger Network's 2017 Unmet Needs Study that in Marion County, about 21% of residents are struggling with this kind of more classic definition of food insecurity. And then when we think about defining food access, we would define it much like Brandon describes it. So this is you're limiting your geographic area to healthy foods, whether defined as access to a retail grocery within a certain mileage or the number of stores in your area. And these technical definitions can include individual level resources, like whether or not your household has access to a private vehicle or what your household income is, but can also include community level resources, like whether or not your community has access to public transportation, you know, the metro or bus service, and then the median household income of your neighborhood. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with the 2014 Redfin Walk score, but that score actually, when we think about food access definitions of that score, it didn't include some of these other metrics that we would consider. And so they only based it on a 5-minute walk. So we know that the city of Indianapolis and Marion County have the same boundaries. So it's very difficult to consider a scenario where majority of residents of the city of Indianapolis are able to walk to a grocery store within 5 minutes. So some measures may be more appropriate to New York City, San Francisco, and then other metrics may be more appropriate for Midwestern communities like Indianapolis. So I bet at the end of the day, we know that the Polis Center has done research about food access. And in 2018, they found that about 195,000 Marion County residents struggle from living in neighborhoods with limited food access.
Thank you. The next question, historically, how have the types of foods and food access impacted the health of African Americans? As I think we see on the screen, there is a cookbook, Plantation Recipes. And I think we have another slide that's going to follow that talks about what traditionally people have eaten. Let's talk about what people have eaten and if it's been good for them. When we had our health panel, we realized many of the foods that were given, or were the only food access that African Americans has had a impact on their health. So the next slide, I think we can see that the types of foods are very important. So we're going to start with Brandon. Let's talk about the types of foods that African Americans have had access to and how that's impacted their health.
Sure. Well, you know, I mean, I think that if you're looking at it in the context of this country, and you know, we look at enslavement and then post, you know, liberation, the access points, you know, were really horrible. Right? So enslaved Africans were given enough to keep them alive, and essentially given the scraps on plantations that the owners and that the plantation masters either didn't want or didn't see a need or a use for. And like any culture, whatever it is that you're given, you're going to find a way in order to make it palatable or desirable. And so you pass that down over 3 or 4 or 10 generations, and then all of a sudden, the food that becomes a cultural identifier is actually a throwback to the systemic oppression that your people experience, but it's what you grew up eating, and you no longer eat it because you have to. You eat it because it's a part of the cultural identifier that's been handed down, because this is what your mother made, this is what your grandmother made, this is how those things were made available to us. But I think the other part of that is that for a very long time, a good number of formerly enslaved Africans, they had their own gardens, right? They had their huck patches on the sides of their houses, where they grew vegetables to be able to supplement those things that were given to them in order to be able to actually round out some sort of a healthier food option for families.
Right. I think the slide said from chitlins from slave food to delicacy.
Yeah.
I don't think many people would think pig intestines would be a delicacy. Representative Shackelford, do you have any, I'm sorry, Brandon, did you have something else you wanted to say?
Well, I was going to say that, the term that, that is kind of tossed around now is when we hear chefs and creatives talk about nose to tail eating, right? Mm-hmm. And the consumption of offal, OFFAL, though it sounds awful to some, right? Mm-hmm. But it has become, kind of viewed as this high-end cuisine. Mm-hmm. To walk in, I remember I took my mom to a restaurant on her birthday, and it was a nicer restaurant, and she almost fainted when she saw the fact that there was an appetizer of pig's feet that was $17. And so, the shock of seeing it on the menu, the double shock of seeing how much it was, and then the third level of shock of seeing this in a predominantly white space, she was just completely mystified by the whole experience.
Absolutely. I can imagine. Representative Shackelford, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. And thanks everyone for putting this together. Thanks United Way. I really appreciate focusing on healthy food access and our food insecurities, especially in our African American communities. I will just go back to Indiana University. They says most of the foods that's consumed in minority communities, you're going to see them be higher in preservatives, sodium, sugar, and caloric value. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about pig feet, ribs, ham hocks, fried foods. A lot of those foods that you see here in our communities are going to lead to a reliance on more of pharmaceutical industry, being on medication. So I was just saying how in the minority community, we see a lot of people now being more reliant on pharmaceuticals because of the things that they're eating. We see much more emergency room visits due to whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, strokes. So the effects of lack of healthy food access and what people are eating in our communities can be very detrimental, including a large number becoming obese.
But thank you for that. Shelley, did you want to weigh in on the foods that African Americans consume?
Yeah, I think lately, kind of with a lot of the discussion around deficit-minded research for those of us in academia, I think it's also important to highlight that African American communities, other minority communities, do consume fresh fruit and vegetable, cooked, prepared food and vegetables, perhaps in a way that's not in accordance with what American dietitians would agree with. But people are eating greens, they're eating sweet potatoes, cabbage, a variety of other fruit and vegetable, but perhaps not in what is considered, our current public health best practices, but they are culturally appropriate to the African American diet.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And apologies for the technical difficulties. Question 3. For decades, many families have grown their own food, and you just spoke about that, Brandon. Gardening is now considered niche, but once upon a time, having a garden meant survival. Why was gardening at the time the only way that many African American families would receive fresh vegetables? Why is it currently so difficult for African Americans to have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, especially since gardening is once again so popular? John?
Well, I'd start by saying, obviously produce is seasonal, it's perishable. So anywhere where we have an access problem, that just exacerbates the problem of getting to any perishable food, not just fresh produce. I'd also say we're at a place culturally in this country where you're not going to close the gap when we have such a daunting or large gap in terms of food insecurity through neighborhood gardens on the smaller scale. It has to be done through large scale investments and continuously improving the program options. I mean, we're an example of that. Prior to the May of 17 launch of the regional co-op that Gleaners runs, we got 0 pounds of fresh produce straight from the farm into the hunger relief system. This year we'll finish with 35 million pounds of produce in our 21 Indiana counties. So pretty substantial growth, and even that has not closed the gap. So scale matters. There's a variation of that story, by the way, on dairy and protein too. So gardens, they solve a fraction of the problem for a fraction of the people. And I'm not discounting the value. I'm just saying it's not enough, and we're not always sure the gardens are matched to where the need is as well. So we have to focus equally on what healthy foods are available and how do we create not just better, but fair, equitable access to that food. I mean, I've been struggling for years with getting people to the food and the transportation side. I'm glad that's your next panel topic, frankly, because there's a strong connection there.
Thank you. Brandon.
You know, I think that there's a couple of elements to look at there. You know, Flanner House in our 122-year history, we for a very long time had an agricultural program where we not only had our own farmland, but we also worked with families in the community to be able to grow their own food. We actually owned and operated our own cannery where people could harvest what they had grown and bring it in and have it professionally canned. Leave behind what they didn't need, take home what they did, leave behind what they didn't need, and sell it off in a food co-op that Flanner House also operated. But as the community evolved and people began to move further and further out to the suburbs and to disparate parts of the city, the demand and the interaction for that basically created it so that it was no longer sustainable. But quite frequently, one of the things I think a lot of times the tragedy of it all is that if we talk about this in the context of the presence of African people on this continent, for 400 years, our people were enslaved to basically grow and produce the food that fed all of America. And in 2 generations, we lost the ability to feed ourselves. And so getting back to that, and, whether it is having a small garden, of your own, or participating in a community gardening project, or, looking at farming projects like ours, where we're talking about and looking at the continued scalability, so that we're actually able to create those access points for people who are income constrained, to be able to create a way that a pathway that says that the most financially practical thing you can do is buy the healthiest food available to you. And that's really, the end game for the work that we're trying to take on.
Absolutely. Shelley, I know you're passionate about this subject. Do you have something that you'd like to add?
So I would say the reason I'm most passionate about this question is because Miss Joyce Moore asked me a question a few years ago that I've been pondering for the last few years. And she said that she remembered when she was younger in Indianapolis, there were many more Black-owned grocery stores, and once segregation was kind of diffused and dismantled throughout Indianapolis, she noticed those Black-owned grocers close. So I've been spending a portion of my research time exploring this question. So we actually know in the mid-1920s, Indiana Avenue alone was home to 26 Black-owned restaurants, grocery stores, butcher shops, bakeries, but that eventually we all know is not with us today. So if we go back into kind of Indiana's history of gardening and agriculture, we know that Indiana's climate and terrain was very harsh, and it was heavily forested in the early part of Indiana's history. So it was difficult for indigenous communities to engage in agriculture, and they had very innovative ways to deal with agriculture early in Indiana's history. Pioneers of all races had difficulties with agriculture early in Indiana's history. But we know that agriculture eventually took off in Indiana. Indiana is known as an agricultural state, and this included Black communities. So Quakers actually supported the migration of Black households to the state. Many rural Black communities are famous for agriculture. So I imagine some folks may be familiar with Lyle Station, Indiana, and this is the Black community that's historically famous as an agricultural community. But this was kind of happening all over the United States at the same time, because the United States was becoming an agricultural state, agricultural country. So we know that about 1910, the amount of farms across the United States peaked, and there were 6.4 million farms across the whole of the United States, owned by people of various different races. And agriculture was the primary profession or occupation of most Americans at that time. But we know now there's only about 2.2 million farms across the United States. So generally across the board, as the population has grown, the share of individuals who are involved in agriculture has obviously declined. So, but we think about at the same time, as the economy is growing and expanding with outside of agriculture, there are many more opportunities for individuals to become involved in the economy. And we know that, not everyone wants to engage in agriculture. So if we really want to think about opportunities for people to be self-sufficient, to feed themselves, we have to think about systemic racism throughout the economy. So discrimination in minority business ownership, discrimination in lending and fair housing, all sorts of things that are continually impacting people's livelihoods and ultimately, their economic potential. So for this question, I always ask myself, is anybody else considering gardening as a solution to overcome racism for other ethnic groups? Why is this discussion focused on African Americans? So I think there's opportunity to really broaden this discussion and think about opportunities for food access to improve food security through other means of the economy, not just agricultural production alone.
Shelley, that was a perfect segue to the very next question, which is, what is the best way to ensure that people have access to food? Is it by focusing on food production, or is it by focusing on the systemic racism and economics? As you see on the screen, we have the slide that we talked about, the community compass, when we were having our earlier conversation, but you just had a beautiful segue. So I thought perhaps you and Brandon might want to speak briefly on this.
You first, Shelley.
Oh, thank you, Brandon. Yeah, so, Brandon, me, John, Representative Shackelford, definitely are all in agreement about the overproduction of food. We know in the United States and in Europe, our agricultural system is overproducing food. There is a glut of food in the system. This is causing very low food prices. This also leads to farmers struggling financially. And this overproduction of food also leads to environmental issues, social issues, labor issues, health issues, as we kind of excessively produce food. So we know that there are ways outside of agricultural production to allow people to have access to food. And so I really think the bottom line on this discussion is that making a living wage is what allows you to purchase groceries, and accumulating wealth is what allows your household to change its diet. And it's very important we support the economic opportunities that allow African American households to accumulate wealth. And so if we want to focus this discussion on the food supply chain, we can think about what the USDA creates in terms of the food dollar. So the USDA's Economic Research Service creates a metric called the food dollar, and it measures the annual expenditure that US consumers spend on domestic food. And so ultimately, this is summarizing what portion of the money we spend goes to different sectors of the food system. And we know that only 15 cents on every food dollar, so 15 cents of every dollar we spend on food goes to farmers. That means 85 cents of every dollar we spend on food goes to something else in the food supply chain. So whether that's food processing, food manufacturing, food distribution, food transportation, food marketing, all sorts of interesting other sectors that support agricultural production getting from farm to fork. We know that these are opportunities to engage minority entrepreneurs, to engage employees, to be successful, to achieve those living wages and to accumulate that wealth to feed themselves.
Okay.
And I would concur, with that. I think we're probably, I differ a little bit in it, is that, the information that Shelley shared is information that people who are policymakers and the ability to enact change have known and haven't.
Mhm.
And as a result of which, we're seeing generation after generation of kids be malnourished and communities be under-resourced. And so, the disposition for me and some of our colleagues in the field is around this conversation around food sovereignty. And what does that really mean that, for a community to really be able to control its destiny in terms of production and access to food that's culturally, socially relevant. But it also then is able to do those things that Shelley mentioned of being able to say, well, we're not just talking about people who are farming and growing, who are we working with on the distribution side and the logistics end, that we can create a neighborhood or a community-owned distribution system, and have the farm that we create in the community be the first client, and then find additional ones, making sure that those growing habitats are GAP certified so they're actually able to sell to schools and to hospitals, and then talk to those schools and other institutions around your anchor strategies for including minority suppliers. And so making sure that that becomes part of that economic component. I mean, I fully recognize that 15 cents only gets to the farmer. However, that other 85 cents, though, we've known the social ills about, women being underpaid. We've known the social ills about people of color being underpaid and denied opportunity. Those are things that we have known. Shelley mentioned Joyce Moore, who is kind of a mentor to a lot of us, in the city. And one of the things that Joyce said to me early on, she said, we already know everything we need to know in order to do everything we need to do. The question is whether or not you have the people who have the will to actually carry it out and do it.
Right.
And that I think is an important component of it.
Absolutely. And so that leads to our next question. How does structural and systematic racism practices and policies impact access to food? And so I'm going to start differently. I'm going to start with John, because John, you have been in the grocery market for a really long time, and now you're on the other side. So do you want to talk a little bit about how the structural and systematic racism practices and policies impact access?
Well, if you don't mind, I just didn't react quickly enough on the last question. I want to reinforce a couple of things. So I was uncharacteristically shy as you transitioned there, I guess, but I really want to reinforce one point Shelley made, which is we need to get at the household income, and that, one good cure for hunger is to have enough money in the household to feed the whole family for the full month. So we have to talk about household wages and so on. And Brookings Institute has done some good work around household pay and public assistance and so on. But also I think it's worth noting again that this whole economics issue was made worse by the pandemic, and we need to prepare ourselves as a community for a longer term recovery. This medical recovery timeline that we're waiting in terms of immunizations and so on is completely different from the multi-year economic recovery. And again, to Shelley's point, if you think about the household net worth for African American families has trended for decades at 10% of the household net worth of white families. That comes into play when you get into a period of crisis and you need a period of recovery. It's all made harder. So there's a systemic problem on the economic side that inhibits recovery on the food security side. So I wanted to emphasize that, but not necessarily ignore your other question. You covered some of the points I was going to make actually in your own intro. The thing I would say too, though, is donors who we deal with, or those who have the resources, are often, there's a bit of uninformed judgment sometimes about who's in the food line, why they're in the food line. The fault lies with those who need help. Are they cheating the system? I mean, the Gleaners team wrestles with that. And I'm also encouraged by those who don't, who are non-judgmental in their approach. But it's a barrier to getting these deeply ingrained misunderstandings about food and food insecurity impede implementing the best solutions sometimes. They're barriers. And Brandon's right on the supply chain side of things. I mean, there's so much that's about getting food to people in the right way, but attitudinal barriers are in the way in terms of where the current system is willing to invest the resources where they're needed. So there's so much that's systemic, not in the systemic sense of racism, systemic in terms of the processes or opportunities we have available to solve things.
Right.
I would say too, we're transitioning the hunger relief system because for decades it was passive, it was reactive. We waited to see what food people chose to donate, and that's what we had to work with to go and feed people. And Gleaners and others are turning that upside down, and we're aggressively going after the right food and to have the right variety and the right nutritional value. And so the system's upside down on purpose right now as we try to go after the right foods and not be quite so passive about what we have to work with resource-wise.
All right. Thank you for that. Representative Shackelford, when we talk about practices and policies, we have to come to you. So do you have a comment for that question?
Yes, Shelley, I just want to hit on that last question about what's the best way between food production or looking at racism. As we've been working on policy, we have heard from farmers saying they would be very interested in supplying additional fruits and vegetables to African-American neighborhoods. One of the challenges is currently they don't get funding to grow these types of fruits and vegetables here in Indiana from the federal government. They only get funding for soybean production and to grow that. Another challenge is getting that fruits and vegetables to African-American neighborhoods. Because if you look at the lack of access and going back to the root of racism, we don't have a lot of grocery stores, a lot of farmers markets where they can actually bring that produce to our neighborhoods. So it's kind of a two-pronged issue and a two-pronged problem that we would need to solve. And I think both need to be focused on. When you talk about policy and people's background and what they're thinking about with racism, out of our 150 legislators, most of them are from rural areas. They're not familiar with or working with African Americans. So they put their beliefs and sometimes their biasness comes through as far as they look at the reason why people are not eating healthy. And they rather blame the person than actually blame the structure or the lack of infrastructure. So you see it being very challenging trying to get through healthy access bills, trying to get through funding for food insecurity, because in their minds, they're thinking that the person just don't want to eat healthy, that it's on them, and they bring all of their backgrounds and beliefs to the policies. So that's another thing that we will have to work on and rectify.
Right. Thank you for that.
Anya, do you mind if I jump in? Representative Shackelford, we certainly see firsthand that people given the choice will take healthier food. They're eager for it. And if it will help you persuade your fellow legislators, you're welcome to join any Gleaners food distribution to show them firsthand.
I will definitely do that. And you know what, John, is so ironic because some of the legislators, they don't have so much of a challenge with the food insecurity. I think they love helping the food banks, even though they haven't increased your funding in years. So they say they love it, but they haven't put money behind it. But it gets more challenging when we want them to fund innovative programs to actually get more access in these neighborhoods. So I think one of the things we definitely need to do is, I think you all know that we have about $1 billion left of CARES Act funding. And I know some of them are interested in using it for food insecurity, and it has to be spent by the end of December. So we can advocate that that CARES Act COVID relief funding actually gets used for healthy access for foods and food insecurity. That will be very beneficial.
I agree, and we've had our eye on that funding, and we're well aware that the Indiana budget's $300,000, the Ohio budget's $23 million. There's a bit of a contrast, but there is some heartening news, though, in that our home delivery program that we built in response to the pandemic has been consistently doing 1,000 households or more a week straight to the door of those who are medically shut in and so on. And so when you do have innovative targeted programs, we can prove them pretty easily. And the city of Indianapolis used some of their funds to actually reimburse us the cost of that program for the last several months. So there is action here in the city with some of those funding. Obviously, there's more work to do, but there's hope.
Well, that leads me to my next question. Before the pandemic, 18% more white households had enough food to eat compared to Black households in Indiana. During the last week of August, so we have very recent data, that gap grew to 21%. What factors would contribute to the pre-pandemic inequities, and how do those relate to the increase seen during the pandemic? We have very current data. I'm going to ask Brandon and Representative Shackelford to speak to that.
You know, there's an old adage that says that if America gets a cold, Black America gets the flu. And really what you're seeing, you know, is that evidence played out right here in real time. And so, you know, those, you know, the impact of COVID, you know, none of us, like as bad as it got, none of us would have, if any of us had tried to say, you know, back in January or December that it was going to hit this hard, this many people, you know, you'd have been laughed at and called crazy. And that was one of the moments when, you know, when an organization like ours, that we historically don't do food crisis intervention. That's not the work that we've historically done. You know, that first week we liquidated everything in our bodega or in our grocery store and turned it into emergency food boxes. And then we started getting the calls from John Elliott's and, you know, the Jennifer Vigrans from Second Helpings, talking about let's develop a more cohesive strategy to really be able to get food to people. And the alarming thing is that it wasn't just food to residents and the kind of folks who have been struggling that we were dealing with before. I mean, you're talking about a significant number of middle class families who have never had to rely on any kind of public assistance before and were virtually lost and didn't know how to even navigate the system in order to be able to get access to that help. So I would even say that the data that you have, as scary as it looks, it's probably even worse than that, because there's a cross-section of people who are too embarrassed to even be caught up in this count to actually be a part of that information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I would just piggyback on that. These figures are definitely reflective of other COVID figures. Looking at the disparity between minorities and them being positive for COVID and also dying from COVID, you see a 20% difference between African Americans and whites across the state. So looking at this 20% as far as the food gap, you think about it, when we have our lack of food, lack of supplies, it just hits us even harder because we already had a lack of access. And so I think our neighborhoods are the last one to get those very few food supplies that were shipped out from whatever company it is. And then also people lost so many jobs, whether if it was our essential workers still working, but we had a lot of African Americans in the Black community actually lose their jobs. So it made it hard for them to get food and to purchase food. So I agree with the other panelists. You have people now who had never had to stand in those lines or go through the drive-through or ask for food, now needing that food, and especially more adamant in the Black community.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So looking forward, what are some tangible solutions that United Way of Central Indiana and our community can champion to address, to ensure that our neighbors have access to healthy food? I'm going to ask all of you to share your thoughts as to what you believe we can do. Because everyone says this is a problem bigger than myself. It is not. It is a problem that if we conquer together, we can correct together. There's no problem too great for all of us. So I'm going to ask each of you, starting with you, Shelley, to give us an idea of what you think that we can do.
Yeah, first I'd definitely like to start to thank everyone in Central Indiana who is engaged in food system work. There's so many creative, innovative programs and projects and activities that are happening throughout the central part of the state, I think it's very important that we recognize these and that we support these activities. And I even thank you, Tanya and Ann, and your teams for hosting these style of conversations and getting people to think about these subjects that they may have not thought about before. But I would say definitely I encourage everyone to stay aware of public policy. As Representative Shackelford said, certain policymakers from communities that are outside of Central Indiana don't understand the dynamic that's happening in Central Indiana. So it's very important that you not only stay abreast of state law that can actually preempt local law, it's important to also stay attuned to what's happening in your local community and the city of Indianapolis and the surrounding counties, just to know kind of where they're thinking in regards to economic policy, social policy, and food policy, because Indianapolis does have a food policy coordinator, Malele Kennedy, who works very hard on these issues. So it's just important to, I would say, stay engaged with the public policy on these discussions.
Thank you, Shelley. John?
I'd say we start with self-awareness. I think it'd be uncomfortable in a topic or situation like this, but we really have to assess our own cultures and attitudes. And I mean that individually, but I mean that at a family or household level, and frankly, in our workplaces. A little bit of introspective tension is good on a topic like this. We also need to accept that hunger doesn't happen in isolation. It's interconnected to other challenges. And so if we expect people to solve a mix of things their family might be dealing with one at a time in isolation, we're kidding ourselves. We have to come together as those with solutions and resources to try our best to hand them the solutions the way they deal with them simultaneously. The other thing that hasn't come up yet in a question, but it's all often on my mind, having spent so much time overseas and living in other cultures and all too, is immigrant populations. There are immigrants and those that are more reluctant to come forward when they need help or less likely to know how to get that help. And so it's not enough for us to be satisfied with who we're serving or who we're helping. We have to go further and figure out who we don't yet know needs help or how to help them. So that's why we've admitted what we don't know at Gleaners, and we're working with several organizations to that purpose. We also need to focus on flow of information. The Community Compass app that Shelley had, a big part of, is a technology tool, but that's not enough. In general, the flow of information to those who need help is imperfect, and we just assume they know what we know, and that's rarely the case. So more proactive activity around flow of information. And again, to reinforce your topic on transportation is critical. We have to focus both on getting people to the food and getting the food to people in a variety of ways that fits their unique situation, and be creative and be innovative and invest more than we've been willing to invest in getting that food to them. Real quickly, I'd say too, if people want to learn more, there are a couple of things I'd recommend. The Frameworks Institute did a nice report called Reframing Hunger in America, particularly well done. And then the National Urban League did one recently on State of Black America Unmasked. And both have some good research and links to further information, because I know we've tried to cram a lot in the time and there's more to learn.
Thank you. Brandon.
I would say that, I think what United Way can do is what United Way has been doing and continue to do so. All of those organizations that I mentioned when we started to respond to the pandemic were all United Way agencies. Right. And so there is this kind of collective wisdom across a network of people that fall under that umbrella, that you can pick up the phone and call, or not even have to call, that there's just intuitively they're like, yep, we got to hit Flannery House, we got to hit the other community centers. It's just this natural connection that exists between us. And to really continue to nurture and grow and emphasize that network would be one. On the policy side, for me, the irony that for me is every day when I drive downtown and I see that big logo across the building that says Indiana is a state that works. And my question is always, works for whom? Because, if we're talking about ALICE data and we're talking about the significant number of people who are working, but also have to work 2 or 3 jobs to be able to make ends meet and still can't afford healthy, nutritious food, then we really need to have a conversation about what it is that what we mean when we say a state that works, because there's no point in bragging about an employment rate if in fact people are having to work themselves to death and undermine quality time with their children and families in order to be able to put what little bit of food on the table that they're able to.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Representative Shackelford?
So I would recommend submitting to the legislators, including myself, any policy ideas that you have, whether if it deals with limiting the bad foods like junk food, soda, unhealthy foods and vending machines, or if it includes helping finance those innovative programs. I will be doing another piece of legislation this session dealing with healthy food access. We've tried it a couple of different ways from the last 4 or 5 years. So this year we will try to be coming up with something different to see what we can get passed. And then just advocating and joining those other coalitions that work with healthy food finance. I know there are some great coalitions out there that I worked with before, and trying to make sure the bills are getting heard, making sure you're emailing and call the legislators and say, okay, this is something that we support. This is one of our priorities that we want to work on. Some of the legislators, I will say, have been coming around more when it deals with trying to eradicate food deserts. Some of the ones that were our challenges have now retired. So it will be a different landscape when we go back in the session, this session, and also with the impact of COVID, you may see more legislators now being more convinced that there needs to be some type of solution to deal with people getting access to healthy food. So those will be some of my recommendations.
Thank you. So what I heard was advocate, 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 learn, and advocate more. That's what I heard. I would like to thank you all for being with us today. I want to apologize once again to our audience for the technical difficulties, but we are so fortunate to have our 4 panelists on the front line working on our behalf of our neighbors, on behalf of all of us, to make sure that we have healthy food options. So, and thank you to our audience for joining us today for this important conversation. I hope you learned something. It is our hope that each and every one of you walked away thinking, there is something that I can do, and this problem is not too large for me to resolve. Please know that you will receive an email with additional resources, as well as a link to register for our next presentation in the series. And what's so exciting, the next presentation will bring it full circle. It is about transportation. I think you've heard Brandon, you heard Shelley, you heard John all say access. You need transportation to get to the food. So next month on October 21st, we will discuss transportation. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy your evening. Good night.